Next, let's talk about importing artwork from other programs like Photoshop. If I go to File, Import, and let's go back to Images, then I'll browse. So here I have that same background from before, but it's not separated into different files. It's all in one Photoshop PSD still. So if I go to import that, it's going to give me this warning that some of the items you're importing contain multiple layers, and then we got to decide what to do with those layers. So I definitely want to create separated layers, and I want the transparency to be straight. Your other option would be a single layer, and in that case it would put the layers from the Photoshop file into an image sequence. So if you did have an animation on layers in a Photoshop file, you could import them as an image sequence that way. In our case, we want separated layers for our background layers. So let's hit OK. And it's working. And there we go. Just like before, we have our separate layers. Next, we're going to look at how to import artwork from Illustrator. We're actually starting out in Illustrator because there's some prep work we have to do before we can import into Toon Boom Harmony. First of all, you want to make sure that your artwork doesn't have any textures on it. Those won't get brought in, and you'll end up with invisible shapes. Secondly, to ensure compatibility, you want to save your Illustrator file as a legacy format. That means when you go up and do File Save, or in my case, I'm going to do Save as Copy. I'm going to name this Character Test Legacy, and then Save. And then it's going to give you these options here. What we want to do is save for an earlier version of Illustrator. CS2 works for me. You also want to make sure Create PDF Compatible File is checked. Now it's going to give you some warnings about features that might not work. In this case, it mostly has to do with text, so I'm not worried about it. So I'm going to hit OK. It's going to warn me again that some features might be lost. And now we're all set. So now, back here in Toon Boom, we've got to do something special too. If we go to Import, the option we want is this bottom one here. Now for you it might be grayed out already, and if I try to use it, it's going to give me a warning that Toon Boom Harmony Advanced.localized is read-only. What that's talking about is over here in the library. Here's the Harmony Advanced library, and you can see that it's locked. What we need to do is right-click and check Write to Modify. Now we're able to add things to the library. With Illustrator files, you can't import them directly to the stage. They need to be imported to the library as a template. You'll see what that means in a second. So now if I go up to Import and choose this option, it lets me browse and find the Character Test Legacy file we created, and then I just hit Open. It's going to process for a second. It's going to ask for a name. I'm going to call it Mound. And now we have a .tpl folder in our library. This is what's called a template. We'll learn more about these in a later video, but for now, all we need to do is click and drag and add it to the stage. Now it's going to give us a warning because the colors that were present in that file are not currently part of our Toon Boom palette. So what it's going to try to do is create it for us. So let's just hit yes. And there we go. Our colors look like they should be all good. And if you look here in our colors palette, you can see we now have a palette for all the colors from that Illustrator file. And our character has been added to the timeline with all his layers preserved. So from here, we could start rigging and animating this character. Next, we're going to look at importing content from Flash, or Adobe Animate as it's now called if you have the latest update. Again, we're starting out in Flash because there's some things you need to do to make sure it's going to import correctly. The main thing is you need to make sure everything that's on your main timeline is in a symbol. If you have any artwork here that's not in a symbol, it's not going to get imported. So you can see in my case, I have one symbol for the character, Then within that are all the different layers for her body parts. So then you just go ahead and export or publish that as a SWF. And then head back to Toon Boom. So here back in Toon Boom, the process is very similar to importing from Illustrator. You need to make sure that your Harmony library is unlocked. Again, you just want to make sure that Right to Modify is checked. Then come to File, Import, and in this case we're going to be doing a SWF, so we select this again. Browse and find the SWF that you just published, and then open it up. Again, it's going to process it, ask you for a name, Valkyrie's good. And now again we have a template file, and we just drag that out. We get the same warning about colors. Well, that looks like it worked pretty well, except something's wrong with her eyes. We can see all the components that make up the character here on our timeline. I know from experience that these layers here are probably her eyes because they have this mask effect on them. We'll learn about these effects later. Since these are at the bottom of the list, that must be why they're not showing up. They must have got placed behind everything else. So I'm just going to shift click to select all these and move them up the stack. There we go. Now everything looks good. And again, in our colors palette, you can see we have a new palette for the Valkyrie character with all of our colors preserved, even all of those special gradients. One more thing we need to fix is that this white background color has been added based on the stage color in Flash. It's added that by adding a color card to the bottom of our layers. A color card is a feature in Harmony that lets you make your background not transparent by just sticking in an arbitrary color. We might be using these ourselves later. In this case, we can just delete it using this minus key. So that's it for importing SWF files. If you're transitioning from Flash to Toon Boom, this technique might be an easy way to start animating with characters you've already built. The only other thing that we can import is sound, but we'll touch on that later when we start talking about lip sync. Next, we're going to dig deeper into creating our own artwork in Toon Boom. We're going to start by taking a closer look at our vector tools.